probing jab, I'm stepping forward and coming back, or a retreating step where I'm retreating this leg, or maybe a check hook where this foot steps out, or stepping across in the opposite direction across center line. Should you stand tall or short, wide or narrow, squared or bladed? Now the answer to that question is yes, you should be using all of them. The real question is, when do you use them? I can square the shoulders but keep the hips bladed, right? So you can see the difference of this, perfectly bladed hips and shoulders, or squared shoulders but bladed hips, all right? So that's something to keep in mind. Now, when do you use a squared stance? When do you use a bladed stance? Generally speaking, you're going to use that bladed stance when you want to stay long on the outside, right? You think about the taller fighters, when they want to throw a jab and get right back out. They want to keep the fight long. They're going to be in a more bladed stance. They want to go like this. They want to get two and they want to get away. And then the fighters that want to get on the inside, or are already on the inside, think about Tyson, think about even Lomachenko and the way that he's able to aggressively move in and change those angles and stances, is going to be more squared when he does it, right? So think about Tyson versus any of his taller opponents. Tyson's very squared because he likes rushing forward and he likes the ability to switch and move his head either side, right? If I'm bladed, it's hard for my head to go over to the lead side. But if I'm halfway there already with my shoulders, it's easier for me to dip or slip out to my lead side. Again, Lomachenko, someone who uses a lot of head movement, likes going side to side from that southpaw stance, constantly switching, whether he's wide or narrow, tall or short, squared or bladed. Again, if he's trying to rush forward and get on the inside, then he's going to square his stance off. And think about just the movement in general, right? Like if I'm running, if I'm sprinting, if I'm trying to advance forward, think about the direction that your toes are facing, right? It's going to be really hard for me to go backwards if my toes are facing forward. But if I'm bladed, it's easy for me to get out or easy to get in, right? Think about a fencer, back, right? Or a tennis player, and they're trying to get left or right to get to the ball, back, this way or this way. It'd be really hard for them to go that way if their feet are facing this way, all right? So, generally speaking, when do you use it? If you're trying to stay on the outside, you're gonna be a little bit more bladed, and you're gonna be using this punch. You're gonna be moving forward and back. If you're trying to get on the inside, you're trying to be a little bit more aggressive, or if the fight has already gotten closer, that's when you can start to square up your stance. Now you have both weapons, both power in both hands, right? I got more power in my left hand. I can really rip these shots, and I'm more defensively sound on the inside. Whereas if I'm here and someone's on the inside, the moment they cut this angle and get over here, no good. I can't hurt them if they're to my backside, but they can hit me, all right? I have to jump and get to them. So once the fight starts getting closer range, even Floyd who does fight a little more bladed, right? A little bit more long, as soon as that fight gets to the inside, he'll adjust, he'll come here. Once he starts getting more aggressive, his stance will square up so that he can tilt his head on either side, so that he can have power in both hands. So when talking about bladed or squared, those are some things to keep in mind, right? The distance of the fight and the different attacks and defensive options that you have in both of those stances. Okay, now let's talk about a wide stance versus a more narrow stance. Now what most people will tell you is that a wide stance means more balance, but less mobility, right? It's harder to move around. And that a narrow stance gives you more mobility or agility, easier to move, but less balance, and I'm easily knocked over. Now there's some truth to this. However, I wouldn't limit it to just those two principles for each. Here's how I teach it, is that a more narrow stance is going to give you more options of where you can place your feet next. There's going to be more steps readily available. Whereas a wide stance, I'm kind of limited to where I can move my feet, right? And they're all valid options. They're all effective options, right? If I'm throwing a probing jab, I'm stepping forward and coming back, or a retreating step where I'm retreating this leg, or maybe a check hook where this foot steps out, or stepping across in the opposite direction across center line. Now, all of those are valid. All of those work. Again, if I'm on the outside, that's perfect. But if I'm trying to switch my stance, if I'm trying to shift forward or run forward, it's going to be easier for me to do that with a more narrow of a stance. You can just think about Ali and that shuffle step. Pretty hard to do that from a wide stance, right? But he would stand tall, especially in his second fight against Joe Frazier. Made great adjustments in that fight. Stayed tall. Well, we're going to talk about tall and short, but he stayed narrow with his feet, and he would use his jab, and he would dance around the ring. And then when he wanted to put a little bit more power, then he would sit down into shots, get a little bit wider with his stance, not too wide because he didn't want to get stuck. So again, think of it like that. When you want more steps, or if you plan on taking more steps, you really want to cut angles, you want to try to get someone's backside, then you want to take those micro steps with a more narrow stance. If you want to stay on the outside and you're going one direction and the opposite direction, then yeah, you can be a little more wide with your stance. Again, look, study fencers and the way that they move, right? They're very wide. They want to step in and get that point, or step out, deflect, parry, and get right back in. Pretty wide of a stance, but they're on a straight line. They're on these railroad tracks. They're not cutting angles left and right. All right, so that's the thing that you got to think about is where are you moving? What is your goal? And are you balanced when doing that? Now we're going to talk about tall and short. Now, should you fight up tall or should you fight short? Now, let me say this first. When I say tall, I don't mean stiff-legged. You should always be in an athletic stance, springing, having a slight bend in your knees. But I'm saying the difference of this and this, right? Fighting tall and fighting low. Now, again, some footage to study is definitely Frazier against Ali. The second fight in particular, you can really see that the difference in styles. Frazier is very low, leaping into shots, trying to get on the inside against the taller fighter. Ali, who's narrow, using his jab, and then would, from time to time, step in and let his power fly, sit down a little bit more, widen his stance a little bit more, and then would go right back to dancing around the ring and using that jab. So, that being said, generally speaking, if you're the shorter fighter with the shorter reach, you don't want to be fighting upright, right? You're going to lose that battle if you're going against someone who's got a good jab. If you want to get on the inside, then you want to be lower. You want to get underneath of shots. Again, we're going to have a little bit more of a squared stance so that we can advance forward, bobbing our head left and right or underneath, switching our stance if that's in our arsenal, cutting those angles. And if we're on the outside with a taller fighter, we want to use that height. We want to use our reach. We don't want to come down to their level so that they can land those shots. We want to keep the head further away. So that's something that you'll see from some fighters where they shift the head from either center or forward over that lead leg, and they'll pull it back here. And they'll lift this shoulder high. They'll parry with this hand. They'll have a nice guard with this lead hand here. And this almost creates an illusion like I'm taller than I am, when in reality all I'm doing is just pulling my head back further away from my opponent's hands. Right? So I'm back here. Back. Now if I narrow up the stance now, I'm even taller. Again, keep an athletic bounce in your stance. And I can always adjust, sit down on my shots when I want a little bit more power. Think about Buster Douglas against Tyson. Think about Lennox Lewis against Mike Tyson, right? With pepper him with jabs. When Tyson would start to go underneath, bang, would sit down a little bit more and let that rear uppercut rip and do some serious damage with that. So these are the different things that you got to keep in mind. You have to understand the benefits, the practicalities of each stance. What are you trying to achieve? So it's okay if you have like a home base or a preferred stance, but you have to know when and why to adjust your stance. Again, some film study, definitely check out Ali and Frazier. Definitely check out Lomachenko's last fight against Teofimo Lopez. You'll be able to see the difference of a more narrow stance in Loma against Teofimo, who had a wider stance, was going to the body a lot, was throwing a lot of power punches. When you lower your body and you're throwing these power shots, it's going to look like a super wide stance. Obviously, he's not hanging out here the whole fight. He's going to be more narrow, a little more than shoulder width apart. But when you step in and throw that jab and someone snaps a picture, it's going to look like a super wide stance, right? So a lot of people use that as reference, whether it's Teofimo or Mayweather. They say, look how wide his stance is. Again, that's not his home base. That's in the middle of a jab to the body. He's trying to lower his head. He's trying to get off center line. He's trying to get more power on that. And then he's going to spring right back to here. So again, you can have a preferred stance, but you should be practicing all of these and understand when and why to use them.